I'm Giorgio Riello from the University of Warwick, and I'm joined here today by Prasannan Parthasarathi at Boston College. And we are going to discuss Prasannan's forthcoming book addressing the issue of divergence. Prasannan Divergence, from Kenneth Pomeranz's famous book, has been mostly about a world divergence set at a specific time, sometimes in the 18th century, between China and Europe. I understand that your forthcoming book takes India into consideration. How does the geography of divergence change when we consider India?
Well, in my book, Why Europe Grew Rich and Asia Did Not, which is looking at the problem from the perspective of the Indian subcontinent, and specifically some of the advanced maritime regions of the Indian subcontinent, Bengal, southeastern India, which is where some of the most evidence now exists from the 18th century. The timing of divergence more or less concurs with what Ken Pomeranz has argued sometime in the late 18th century is when the process of divergence begins, even from the perspective of India. But the process itself is seen in very different terms once we look at it from the perspective of India. And most obviously, cotton textiles becomes a very important sector in which divergence takes place in this 18th century period.
Yes, I wanted exactly to talk with you about factors, because of course the model of divergence is based on key factors, the famous 2Cs that is called in colonies. And I was wondering if when we start taking into consideration India, the role of coal in colonies diminishes, or if there are other factors, or even if a model considering factors is still a good model or not.
Well, I think coal is still extremely important and figures in my account as well. But I think the timing of coal becomes much more critical, I think, after 1830. But even before 1830, you do, I would argue, have divergence. I mean, coal is used before 1830 in the smelting of iron, but as a new power source for steam engines and so forth, it's really after 1830 and the railway age and the diffusion of steam engines on a much larger scale that coal becomes critical. Before 1830, though, you have a very dramatic shift in the center of the world textile manufacturing away from the Indian subcontinent and these advanced maritime regions to northwestern England, which I think begins from the 1770s, really with the invention of Arkwright's water frame, and then accelerates with the mule. So I think cotton itself is critical to understanding a seismic shift in the nature of the global economy and the global trading system as India begins to lose export markets from the early 19th century to British manufacturers. But coal becomes critical, I argue, at a slightly later point, but you cannot explain economic growth in 19th century Britain without coal.
I'm going back to the other C, that is colonies, in a second. I'm interested also in exploring this issue that you raise of cotton textile, with which, by the way, we have worked together.
Yes.
And I was wondering how much then technology that has been considered slightly old ways of explaining things comes back into your picture as a central maker of difference or maker of divergence between Europe, in this case, and India.
I think technology is absolutely central to explaining this divergence, and it may not be surprising that I think technology is so critical. I was a student of David Landis many years ago, but I approached the issue of technology and technological dynamism in Europe in very different ways than he does. But without technology, the tremendous costs, decline in costs for textile production, which allowed Britain to export on such massive scales in the 19th century, simply cannot be explained without the technological breakthroughs.
Considering then colonies, because of course Kenneth Pomeranz put lots of emphasis on colonies, but it was mostly the American colonies, North American colonies.
Yes.
Well, it seems to me that by involving India, you have two issues. One is that India itself becomes a colony of a very different part of a British Empire in that case. And secondly, that the typical exercise of comparisons in which you compare distinct and different, not interrelated units, might be China and Europe until, let's say, 1800, becomes much more complicated because you have a strong interaction between the units of analysis, in your case, India and Europe.
Yes, and you have a very strong interaction, which I think is also why a global history is necessary to explain this problem, because there is a global economy in which Britain, other parts of Europe, and India are fit into in very different ways in the 18th century as well as in the 19th century. And I think that's a critical part of my larger explanation, that it's this need to try to outcompete India that propels a lot of inventive activity in Western Europe, and intense activity to try to first imitate and then surpass Indian cotton textiles is a critical part of the story. And then likewise, when India becomes a British colony, and then from the late 18th century, you have, in the early 19th century, one of the arguments of my book is that you actually have a remarkable transfer of technology that takes place for the first few decades of the 19th century. India, by the late 1820s, actually starts to manufacture steam engines. You have modern iron smelting technology and machinery brought from Britain, spinning machinery in a number of places. Shipbuilding is transformed in light of European developments. But unlike Britain in the 18th century, which received a lot of state support for the development of its indigenous manufacturing, the Indian subcontinent, I argue, in the early 19th century was able to absorb and make use of some of the cutting-edge technologies, but it couldn't really take root because state support was for British manufacturing. India was not allowed to develop any manufacturing that reduced imports of British manufactured goods or competed with British manufactured goods in world markets. So the problem in the 19th century then wasn't a kind of Indian resistance to new technologies and so forth, but simply not the proper economic and political support for the use of these new technologies. And I think that dimension of colonies and imperialism of this sort and how it shaped Asian economic development in the 19th century is something that's absent in Ken Pomerantz's book.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to have the state back at the end as one of the explanations, not to create a dichotomy between nation states and global history. We very much look forward to your forthcoming book.
Thank you, Giorgio.